When I first moved into the neighborhood, I wasn't looking for trouble. I wanted peace, privacy, and the ability to enjoy my home without constant interference. My property backed onto a busy street, and for me, a tall privacy fence was essential. It wasn't just about keeping out noise or nosy neighbors. It was about creating a sanctuary where I could finally feel at ease. I invested in a well-built wooden fence that was higher than most, stretching along the length of my backyard. It wasn't an eyesore, it wasn't unsafe, and it certainly wasn't harming anyone. But in neighborhoods run by a homeowners association, what makes sense rarely matters. At first, I noticed little things. The HOA president, a sharp-eyed woman who seemed to take joy in nitpicking every resident, began slowing down whenever she walked past my house. Sometimes she would pause at the end of my driveway, staring at the fence as though it had personally offended her. Other board members followed suit, whispering among themselves whenever they passed. I knew they were circling, waiting for the moment to pounce. That moment came in the form of a letter, neatly folded, stuffed into an envelope with the HOA logo at the top. It wasn't friendly, it wasn't welcoming. It was a violation notice. According to the board, my fence was non-compliant because it exceeded the maximum height restriction outlined in the HOA's rules. I was ordered to bring it down by 2 feet or face fines. The letter felt like a punch in the gut. I had spent thousands of dollars installing the fence, making sure it was sturdy, polished, and professional. I didn't cut corners. I did everything by the book, at least by what I thought was the book. The HOA's claim that it was too tall made no sense, because when I checked the bylaws before building, the rules around fences were vague and outdated. There was no clear maximum height restriction listed, only vague references to maintaining uniformity. Still, the HOA had made their move, and now I was in their sights. I could have taken down the fence, quietly swallowed the loss, and accepted defeat. Many neighbors had done the same when the HOA targeted them. But I wasn't going to. I had worked too hard, spent too much, and given too much to simply give in because a group of petty board members decided they didn't like the way my fence looked. I appealed their decision, thinking logic and fairness might prevail. But logic is the last thing HOAs are known for. At the next meeting, the board upheld their violation notice. My fence, they insisted, had come down. They even threatened to fine me $100 for every week I failed to comply. The president's smug expression told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. I left that meeting with a storm of emotions, anger, frustration, but also determination. If the HOA wanted to fight, then they would get one. But I wouldn't fight recklessly. I would fight smart. And that meant finding the one thing HOAs hate more than anything else: loopholes. That night, I pored over every document I could find. The HOA bylaws, the county zoning laws, the municipal codes, all of it. It was tedious, exhausting, but necessary. And as I read deeper into the official city ordinances, I found something the HOA didn't expect me to find. While the HOA had vague language about fence heights, the county actually had very clear rules. In my zoning district, privacy fences were permitted up to 8 feet tall along rear property lines. And the kicker? The HOA bylaws couldn't override local law. Suddenly, a plan began forming. The HOA thought they had me cornered, but in reality, they had just given me the perfect excuse to not only keep my fence, but make it even taller. Still, I knew I couldn't just act without strategy. If I wanted to win this battle, I had to play it carefully. I needed the HOA to commit to their position first, so that when I struck back, they wouldn't be able to retreat without humiliation. So I waited. I let the letters pile up. I let the fines accumulate on paper, knowing they had no legal standing until proven in court. And while they were busy patting themselves on the back for enforcing the rules, I was preparing a surprise that would flip the entire situation on its head. Because this wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about teaching the HOA a lesson they wouldn't forget. They wanted me to lower my fence so they could see over it. But soon, they would discover that not only could they not force me to take it down, they wouldn't even be able to peek into my yard ever again. The battle lines were drawn. My neighbors were watching, curious about how far I was willing to push back. The HOA was circling, convinced they had me trapped. But in reality, they were walking straight into a trap of my own making. And when it finally snapped shut, there would be no way out. The HOA didn't waste any time. As soon as I refused to comply with their so-called violation notice, they turned up the heat. Every week, without fail, another letter arrived in my mailbox. Some were official reminders about the fines that were supposedly accruing against me. Others were threats, dressed up in legal language, warning me of potential liens, court actions, and property restrictions if I didn't obey. To the HOA, this was just another power play. They had used the same tactics on other homeowners in the past, and most had folded under the pressure. For many people, the fear of mounting fines or legal costs was enough to break their resolve. But I wasn't most people. I knew something they didn't, that their threats were meaningless unless they could stand on actual legal ground. At first, I let them think they were winning. I collected every letter, kept detailed notes, and documented each interaction. I didn't argue back. I didn't respond emotionally. I simply let them dig themselves deeper. The HOA president, smug as ever, began bragging to neighbors that I would fall in line soon enough. They had no idea that with every letter they sent, they were actually strengthening my case against them. Behind the scenes, I was preparing for war. I contacted the city's zoning office to request written confirmation of the fence regulations. They provided me with clear documentation that fences along rear property lines could legally stand up to 8 feet tall. My fence, as it stood, was only 6.5 feet. Not only was I within my rights, but I still had another 1.5 feet of legal height I could use if I wanted to. That discovery was like striking gold. The HOA had been insisting that my fence violated their community standards, but the law was clear. Local ordinances always trumped HOA bylaws. Their threats, their fines, their intimidation. It all crumbled the moment real law entered the picture. Still, I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. I wanted them to fully commit to their fight, to waste their time and energy pursuing a battle they could never win. And so, I let the situation escalate further. The board began posting violation notices not just in my mailbox, but taped to my front door where all the neighbors could see. They wanted to humiliate me, to paint me as a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. Some neighbors started whispering, unsure whether to side with me or the HOA. Others, tired of the board's constant power trips, quietly cheered me on. I became the center of neighborhood gossip, the homeowner who dared to defy the almighty HOA. Then came the legal letter, a formal notice drafted by the HOA's attorney, claiming they would place a lien on my property if I didn't reduce the height of my fence immediately. It was exactly the kind of scare tactic they relied on, using legal jargon to frighten homeowners into compliance. But for me, it was the final piece I needed. That letter gave me grounds to escalate this beyond the petty reach of the HOA. I consulted with my own attorney, a man who had dealt with countless HOA disputes before. When I showed him the local zoning ordinance alongside the HOA's threats, he couldn't help but laugh. His advice was simple: let them keep digging, and when the time was right, hit them with everything at once. So that's what I did. For weeks, I endured their campaign of pressure, collecting every scrap of paper they sent, every notice they posted, every baseless threat they made. All the while, I began quietly drafting plans for a renovation, an upgrade to my already too tall fence. If the HOA wanted to fight over 6.5 feet, they were in for a rude awakening when I pushed it to the full legal limit of 8 feet. The idea thrilled me. Not only would I win, but I would win so decisively that the HOA would never dare target me again. My backyard would become the fortress they feared most, completely shielded, untouchable, and legally protected. But before I could reveal my masterstroke, the HOA tried one final tactic. They scheduled a special board meeting specifically about my property, inviting the community to attend. It was their attempt to rally public opinion against me, to pressure me through embarrassment and isolation. When the night of the meeting arrived, I showed up with a folder full of documents. The board wasted no time in listing off my violations, their voices dripping with authority. They spoke as if the decision was final, as if I had no choice but to obey. But what they didn't realize was that they were about to hand me the stage I had been waiting for. As they wrapped up their case, I calmly placed the city's zoning ordinance on the table. I explained clearly and simply that my fence was entirely legal and that local law superseded their bylaws. I pointed out that their threats of fines, liens, and legal action were not only baseless, but bordered on harassment. And then, for the final blow, I revealed my intent to extend my fence to the full 8-foot height allowed by law. The room fell silent. The board members, who had spent months trying to bully me, suddenly looked like children caught misbehaving. The neighbors, who had been unsure of where to stand, now saw the truth laid bare before them. The HOA had overplayed their hand, and I had just called their bluff in front of everyone. The president tried to maintain composure, but it was clear she was rattled. Their authority, once unchallenged, had been shattered in a single night. And I wasn't finished yet, because if they thought an 8-foot fence was bad, they had no idea what I had planned next. The night of the meeting shifted everything. For months, the HOA had operated under the illusion that their authority was absolute. They thrived on intimidation, on the fear that homeowners would never dare challenge them. But in one evening, that illusion crumbled. I had not only proven that my fence was legal, but I had humiliated them in front of the very people they claimed to represent. You would think that humiliation might have forced them to back down. Any reasonable group would have accepted defeat, regrouped quietly, and moved on. But the HOA board wasn't reasonable. Their pride had been bruised, and pride is a dangerous thing in the hands of people who wield power without accountability. In the days that followed, I noticed their retaliation. A board member would drive slowly past my house, jotting down notes on a clipboard. I received new violation notices for trivial things. My garbage bins being visible for a few minutes too long, a patch of grass that looked slightly uneven, even suppose improper placement of my garden hose. None of these complaints had any real weight, but they weren't meant to be legitimate. They were meant to remind me that I was a target, but I wasn't intimidated. In fact, their desperation only motivated me further. Every notice they sent went into my growing archive of evidence. Every petty attempt at harassment became one more nail in the coffin of their credibility. And all the while, I was preparing to do the very thing they feared most, make my fence taller. I contacted a licensed contractor, explaining exactly what I wanted. The existing fence would be reinforced, extended a full 8 feet allowed by law, and finished with a design that not only looked professional, but completely blocked any line of sight from outside. This wouldn't be a patch job or a makeshift fix. It would be a fortress, solid and undeniable. The contractor reviewed the zoning ordinances I provided, nodded in approval, and agreed to take the project on. When construction began, it was impossible to hide. Trucks pulled up, workers unloaded supplies, and the sound of power tools echoed to the neighborhood. Neighbors peeked out of windows, curious about what was happening. Some gave me encouraging nods, clearly enjoying the sight of the HOA losing ground. Others, likely loyal to the board, whispered disapprovingly as though the sight of me exercising my rights was somehow offensive. The board, of course, was furious. Within days, I received yet another letter, this time accusing me of performing unauthorized construction. They claimed I had failed to seek HOA approval for the renovation, but I knew better. The law required permits from the city, not permission slips from the HOA, and my permits were already secured. When the president herself marched up to my property one afternoon, standing on the sidewalk and glaring at the workers as though her presence alone could stop them, I didn't say a word. I simply watched as she fumed, powerless to intervene. The fence was rising higher with every passing hour, and with it, the HOA's control was crumbling. By the time the project was finished, my backyard had transformed into a true private sanctuary. The new fence stood tall, uniform, and perfectly within the legal limit. From the outside, there was nothing to see, no glimpse of my yard, no view into my life, no opportunity for nosy neighbors or HOA spies to peek inside. The sense of satisfaction was overwhelming. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I felt completely free. I could sit in my backyard without feeling watched. I could enjoy my space without worrying about petty complaints. The HOA had demanded I lower my fence so they could see over it, but instead, I had raised it higher than ever, legally and permanently. But victory didn't mean peace. The board, embarrassed and enraged, wasn't finished with me yet. They began spreading rumors, telling neighbors that my defiance would drive down property values. They threatened to pursue further legal action, though they had no grounds left to stand on. Their attempts to intimidate me had failed, but they were too stubborn to admit it. And then, the most ironic twist of all occurred. The very neighbors who had once stayed silent, watching from the sidelines, began approaching me with their own stories. Tales of unfair fines, of harassment over trivial issues, of board members abusing their authority to settle personal grudges. For years, people had suffered in silence, too afraid to push back. But now, seeing me stand tall, literally and figuratively, something changed. I had become a symbol of resistance. My fence was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was proof that the HOA wasn't untouchable. And that realization was spreading quickly. The board sensed a shift, and it terrified them. Their control relied on fear, but fear was slipping away. They had made me their enemy. But in doing so, they had created a spark that could ignite the entire neighborhood against them. And while they scrambled to salvage their reputation, I was already planning my next move. Because I wasn't content with just protecting myself. I wanted to ensure that no homeowner in this community would ever suffer the same harassment again. The battle over my fence was won, but the war against the HOA's corruption was only just beginning. The completion of my fence marked more than just the end of a personal battle. It became the spark that shifted the balance of power in the neighborhood. For months, the HOA board had wielded its authority like a weapon, enforcing vague rules and issuing arbitrary fines with little resistance. Most homeowners complied, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid. The threat of escalating fines, liens, or even foreclosure was enough to silence them. But my fence changed that. It stood tall, bold, and untouchable, a visible reminder that the board's authority had limits. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began knocking on my door, sharing their frustrations in hushed tones. Some told me about the fines they had paid for things as minor, as leaving a garden gnome out front or painting their shutters the wrong shade of beige. Others admitted that they had wanted to push back, but felt too intimidated to stand alone. Now, they didn't feel alone anymore. The HOA sensed the shift almost immediately. The board's members, rattled by their very public defeat, scrambled to reassert control. They began drafting new rules, longer, stricter, and more invasive than before. These proposed amendments included restrictions on everything from where trash bins could be stored, to how long cars could be parked on the street, to the height and type of landscaping homeowners could have in their yards. It was clear what they were doing. If they couldn't control me through the existing bylaws, they would rewrite them altogether. They wanted to suffocate the community with micromanagement, ensuring that no one could challenge their authority again. But what they failed to realize was that their actions weren't tightening their grip, they were loosening it. For the first time, homeowners began speaking out at meetings. People who had never attended before showed up, emboldened by the example I had set. Voices that once trembled with fear now carried strength, demanding accountability and transparency. The board, once accustomed to nodding approval from a compliant crowd, now faced a room full of defiance. I watched it unfold with a mixture of pride and caution. Pride, because the neighbors were finally finding their voices. Caution, because I knew the board wouldn't go down quietly. Desperate people cling to power in desperate ways, and I could sense the storm building. The board doubled down on scare tactics. Letters warning of community decline were mailed out en masse, painting a bleak picture of falling property values if homeowners didn't support stricter enforcement. They threatened special assessments, claiming that without tighter rules, the neighborhood would become unlivable. It was propaganda, plain and simple, but for some, it worked. A small group of loyalists clung to the board's rhetoric, convinced that order had to be maintained at any cost. The neighborhood became divided. On one side were the board and its loyalists, clinging control and pushing for ever stricter rules. On the other were the homeowners, growing bolder by the day, tired of being treated like tenants in their own homes. And right in the middle of it all was me, the unwilling symbol of rebellion, my towering fence casting a shadow not just on my yard, but on the entire HOA itself. The tension reached a boiling point when the board called for a vote on their new rules. They packed the agenda with proposals designed to crush homeowner autonomy, knowing that if they passed, resistance would become nearly impossible. But this time, the homeowners were ready. Word spread quickly. Flyers appeared on doors, neighbors organized informal gatherings, and conversations buzzed with urgency. For the first time in years, the community was mobilizing, not under the leadership of the HOA, but against it. When the night of the vote arrived, the meeting hall was overflowing. Every chair was filled, people lined the walls, and the atmosphere was electric. The board members sat at their long table, shuffling papers nervously as the crowd murmured with anticipation. They had expected compliance, but what they faced was an uprising. One by one, neighbors stood to voice their opposition. They shared their stories of unfair treatment, of fines that felt more like extortion, of rules that served no purpose other than to exert control. The board tried to maintain order, but the tide had turned. When the votes were finally cast, the results were undeniable. The proposed amendments were rejected overwhelmingly. The board members looked stunned, their faces pale with disbelief. They had assumed their power was absolute, but now they were confronted with the truth. They were no longer feared, and without fear, their authority was crumbling. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors crowded around me, thanking me for standing firm, for showing that the HOA wasn't invincible. But I knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it was only the beginning. The board wouldn't simply accept defeat. They would fight harder, dig deeper, and lash out in whatever ways they could. And I was ready, because while they were plotting their next move, I was already planning mine. The fence had been my shield, my fortress. But now, I was preparing for something bigger. The neighborhood didn't just need protection, it needed liberation. And if the board thought they could tighten their grip again, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The failed vote was a turning point the HOA board hadn't anticipated. For years, they had ruled without challenge, secure in the knowledge that homeowners would comply rather than resist. But the rejection of their new rules shattered that illusion. They were humiliated, weakened, and scrambling to regain control. And humiliation breeds desperation. In the weeks that followed, the board shifted from subtle pressure to outright aggression. Their campaign of retaliation became sharper, louder, and more reckless. Where once they had hidden behind carefully worded violation notices and vague bylaws, now they resorted to open hostility. It started with me. My mailbox filled with letters accusing me of new violations, each more absurd than the last. They claimed my fence was painted in an unapproved shade, even though it was left in its natural wood finish. They accused me of creating a nuisance by having construction equipment in my driveway, despite the fact that the work had been completed weeks earlier. They even alleged that my backyard lights, which barely glowed beyond my fence, were disturbing the neighborhood. Each accusation was hollow, but that wasn't the point. The board wasn't trying to enforce rules anymore. They were trying to bury me under harassment, to exhaust me into submission. But it wasn't just me. Other homeowners began receiving similar notices. The family down the street was fined for having a children's basketball hoop in their driveway. An elderly couple was cited for improper landscaping because a few leaves had gathered near their hedges. Another neighbor was threatened with a lien for leaving their holiday decorations up 2 days past the arbitrary deadline. The board had made a mistake. Instead of isolating me as their singular target, they had spread their attacks too wide. In their desperation to reassert dominance, they created enemies out of nearly everyone. The neighborhood buzzed with frustration. Conversations that once carried whispers of fear now brimmed with outrage. People compared notes, shared letters, and realized just how far the board had overstepped. For the first time, the pattern of abuse became undeniable. Still, the board clung to their arrogance. They believed their authority was unshakable, that the homeowners' anger would fizzle out. At one meeting, they even boasted about their duty to maintain order, as though harassment was a noble responsibility. But behind their bravado, cracks were forming. Attendance at board meetings swelled, not with quiet compliance, but with fiery opposition. And then came the breaking point. One evening, I received a letter not just accusing me of violations, but demanding immediate payment of thousands of dollars in fines that had been piling up since the very beginning of my fence dispute. According to their calculations, I owed them nearly $7,000. If I didn't pay, they threatened to initiate foreclosure proceedings on my home. It was their boldest move yet, and also their biggest mistake. I had been waiting for this moment. Every letter they sent, every violation they claimed, every baseless threat they made. I had saved it all. My folder of evidence had grown thick, meticulously organized and backed by legal documentation. And now, with their outrageous demand in hand, I finally had the smoking gun. I met with my attorney the very next day. He reviewed the documents carefully, his expression shifting from amusement to disbelief. By the time he finished, he had only one response. It's time to strike back. Together, we drafted a formal complaint, not to the HOA board, but to the county authorities and the state's attorney general's office. We laid out every example of harassment, every baseless fine, every attempt at intimidation. We included the zoning ordinances proving my fence was legal, the letters threatening foreclosure without cause, and the countless instances of the board abusing its power. The complaint was filed, and within weeks, the consequences began to unfold. The board, smug in their belief that they held all the cards, suddenly found themselves under investigation. County officials requested their financial records, auditing years of collective fines and fees. The Attorney General's office opened an inquiry into whether the board had engaged in unlawful practices. What had once been a campaign of fear was now evidence in a case against them. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Homeowners who had felt powerless for years suddenly realized the tide had turned. They rallied together, attending meetings not just to oppose the board, but to demand resignations. Calls for new elections echoed through the community, louder each time. The board tried to hold firm, insisting they had done nothing wrong. But the pressure was unbearable. Their authority, once unquestioned, was now mocked openly. Their allies dwindled. Their threats carried no weight. The very people they had ruled over were no longer afraid. And in the center of it all stood my fence, tall and unmovable, the symbol of everything they had failed to control. By the time county investigators arrived to review the HOA's practices, the board was fractured. Members argued with each other, blaming one another for the disaster. The president, once so smug and commanding, now avoided eye contact at meetings, her confidence shattered. It was clear the end was near. The question wasn't the board would fall, it was how spectacularly it would collapse. And as the neighborhood gathered strength, preparing to oust the old regime, I knew the final chapter was about to begin. Because this wasn't just about winning against the HOA anymore. It was about dismantling the very system that had allowed them to abuse their power for so long. And once the dust settled, the neighborhood would never be the same again. The pressure on the HOA board built like a storm cloud ready to burst. What had started as a petty dispute over the height of my fence had snowballed into a full-scale rebellion, one that the board was no longer equipped to handle. Their arrogance had blinded them. Their harassment had united the neighborhood, and their obsession with control had attracted the attention of the authorities. By the time investigators began combing through the HOA's records, it was already too late. Years of questionable practices lay buried in their files. Improperly collected fines, vague assessments that were never accounted for, even signs of misused funds. Every dollar they had squeezed from frightened homeowners became evidence against them. The president, once so confident, now scrambled to explain where the money had gone. But no explanation could hide the truth. The board had overreached, and now their empire was crumbling. The homeowners, once a scattered and intimidated group, came together with newfound strength. Meetings that used to draw only a handful of passive attendees now overflowed with angry, determined voices. People who had silently suffered fines and intimidation stood up and shared their stories. One by one, the board's reputation unraveled. The president's smug authority gave way to stammering excuses. Other board members, unwilling to sink with the ship, began resigning one after another. It didn't take long for the board to fracture completely. The community called for a recall election, and when the day came, the results were decisive. Every single incumbent was voted out, replaced with homeowners who promised transparency, fairness, and accountability. The HOA that had once ruled with fear was dismantled in a single evening, undone by the very people it tried to control. The aftermath was nothing short of transformative. With the old board gone, the new leadership immediately began cleaning house. Unlawful fines were rescinded, bogus violations were erased from records, and a new system of checks and balances was introduced to ensure no board could ever abuse its power again. Homeowners who had once dreaded living under the HOA's rule now felt a sense of relief, even hope. For the first time in years, the neighborhood belonged to its residents, not to a handful of power-hungry enforcers. And through it all, my fence stood tall. It had started as a simple structure, wooden planks meant to keep my yard private, but it had become something far greater, a symbol of resistance, of resilience, of what happens when you refuse to be bullied into submission. Neighbors often joked that the board had destroyed itself by trying to take down my fence. And, in a way, they were right. That single battle had revealed the cracks in their authority and given people the courage to stand against them. I would sit in my backyard sometimes, leaning against the 8-foot wall that had sparked it all, and think about how far things had come. The board had wanted me to lower it, to strip away my privacy and remind me of their control. Instead, I had raised it higher, both literally and figuratively, until they couldn't see over it at all. They hadn't just lost sight of my yard, they had lost sight of their power. The former president avoided me whenever we crossed paths. Her pride shattered beyond repair. Some of her allies moved away, unable to face the community they had once tried to dominate. Others quietly melted back into ordinary life, no longer eager to serve on a board that no one respected anymore. The neighborhood, once divided, began to heal. Barbecues popped up again in backyards. Kids rode bikes down the street without fear of complaints, and neighbors who had once stayed silent found themselves chatting openly, no longer afraid of being reported for trivial nonsense. The sense of community, strangled for so long by unnecessary rules, slowly returned. Looking back, I realized the HOA had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. They thought I would bend under pressure, that fear fines and threats would break me as it had broken others. But instead, I pushed back, and in doing so, I showed everyone else that the board's power was only as strong as the fear inspired. Remove the fear, and the power crumbles. My fence wasn't just a barrier between me and the outside world. It was a line I refused to let them cross. And once I drew that line, everything changed. Years later, when people new to the neighborhood asked about the towering fence at the edge of my yard, longtime residents would smile and tell them the story. They would explain how a fight over a few inches would grew into a battle that toppled an entire board, how the HOA that once ruled with an iron fist was undone by its own arrogance. And I would smile too, knowing that the fence had become a legend of sorts. Not just a wall of wood and nails, but a reminder of what happens when you refuse to bow to tyranny, no matter how small or petty it may seem. The HOA had said my fence was too tall, but in the end, it was their pride, their arrogance, and their hunger for control that reached too high. And when it all came crashing down, the only thing still standing, firm, legal, and untouchable, was a fence they had tried so hard to destroy.